Okay, so my talk's in two parts. The first looks at how we generally think about order and introduces the theory of Christopher Alexander, who argues order lies at the root of beauty, which correlates to natural systems. The second part pulls on René Thom's semiophysics and Hoffmeyer and Nemec's idea of co-duality. The second part is less formulated. It's a work in progress. The purpose being to set out a general framework of order, because Christopher Alexander claims this doesn't exist, at least in terms that spans natural systems through to human culture, with architecture being the highest form of semiotic activity, obviously. Okay, so generally speaking, order refers to the logical or comprehensible arrangement among separate elements of a group. So we immediately understand order to be about separation, to distinguish one thing from another, and in so doing, form assemblies or gathering things according to shared criteria. In so doing, we classify things, associating distinctions and compartmentalizing them according to shared features or characteristics. But we also tend to think of order socially in terms of the arrangement or disposition of common individuals in relation to each other and external features, and how this leads to patterns, which we tend to think of systemically, giving rise to notions of organization and sequencing. So order is a means of organizing the world of phenomena, and representation is key to this. In the case of physics, this boils down to representing the mechanics of phenomena according to lines and symbols. For example, to deliberate trajectories of objects and the tendencies of elements, forces are depicted according to position in time and space. Whereas biology is more concerned with processes describing the development of forms and the relations defining physiological regulation, illustrated through cybernetic diagrams describing myriad interconnecting systems. Architectural design extends both, representationally speaking, driven by processes of generation, to develop and describe forms to be constructed, done with concern for numerous relations and tendencies of matter and their physical and perceptual impact. But the configuration of form is not generally determined by physiological regulation and can be whimsical. So what I'm showing here is the work of students in my studio, exploring an algorithmic process of construction whereby they translate verbs into forces which they apply sequentially to incipient forms to transform a primitive cube into a differentiated assembly. And this is just an example of a different student, their final proposal following the same process. And this is a sample, just a short, small sample of others. The point being is that the same process can be applied according to the student's inclination and impulse. And as the form develops and they become more familiar with it, what they develop becomes driven by their inclination. So the focus becomes a production of something perceived to be appealing. And it's here I want to introduce the theory of Christopher Alexander, because the idea of beauty or appealingness is central to his argument concerning the nature of order. So he argues architecture and life are underpinned by order, and that architects are in a unique position to define a universal definition of order, because design extends from or encompasses physics, and being concerned with form and function correlates to biology. But importantly, the purpose of architecture is to generate order for societal function, and that through appropriate conformation of matter, order, understood as harmony, is defined, and he characterizes beauty. So he presents a broad notion of life whereby all things have some degree of life. What he means by this is that what he means by something having a degree of life is that it is composed of what he refers to as centers, which equate to a whole, and that this is something that we feel. He says, quote, "Wholeness is a system of centers which, working together, create the gestalt of a given space," end quote. It is centers, or the composition of centers, that we perceive as wholeness, which are defined by structure that he sees as having life. So wholeness, in his terms, boils down to structure which provokes feeling in a percipient. Organisms are a special form of life because they are wholes, composed of wholes, and architecture, he claims, should strive for such wholeness. What you see here is a definite center, or what he calls a strong center, and is perhaps the simplest illustration of this argument. But note the latent structure in what you see defined by the location of the dot, which triggers perception of symmetries. And in this, one can, I trust, see the potential nascent centers. Essentially, Alexander's argument is based on the idea that we feel the life of something, i.e., we sense different degrees of life in one thing and another, and this is defined by structure or the geometrical associations between centers. And this is just a very primitive demonstration of that. So he applies this to built environment to argue how some architecture is good and some is bad. Based on this notion of feeling, he claims the good stuff is concept-free, not intellectually driven or a matter of statement, rather something that is situated, textual, nature-oriented, and for him, this corresponds to traditional or vernacular architecture, and so is contra modern architecture. In Uxkullian terms, he presents a notion of perfect fitting, such that a form fits multi-relationally. But Uxkull's notion of beauty is semiotic, and as such is not determined by judgment, but by the confirmation of relations, whereas Alexander's argument topples into opinion. So Alexander presents a compelling definition of order spanning nature and human culture, but the value of what he presents is undermined by his preference, and that he neglects that humans are driven by symbols. As Deacon stresses, we are symbolic creatures. Symbols are abstract, standing for something distinctly. In Persian terms, they relate to habit and maybe an argument. In this sense, what Alexander finds distasteful and disregarding nature because it expresses something other is of or an extension of nature, the product of a symbolic species which unfolds in a manner differently to what Alexander considers is necessary because it doesn't fit his frame of reference for what he deems beautiful. So if we take Seebiot's claim that language and human culture is an extension of nature, determined through the capacity to generate and distinguish symbols, then architecture is also not separate, but an extension of nature. But unlike language, which has developed progressively, might say organically, contemporary architecture came about only 100 years ago. So it's a relatively recent human development jolted into existence by the convergence of technology, social tension, and the devastation of World War. What's important in Seebiot's analysis is that language is modeling, indeed nature models. So language and architecture are simply new forms of modeling, which for humans are distinct from what we know of the rest of the natural world. So architecture is a symbolic niche, in which almost endless variety and differentiation provides flexibility and relative freedom to express. Le Corbusier, a principle of modernist architecture and whose buildings Alexander considers monstrous, claimed geometry is a language of man and that the regularities contained in it, such as the golden ratio, are at the root of human activity. So we see here a correlation with Seebiot in that geometry is a primary human science system, and as Cobley emphasizes, provides freedom and relative flexibility to express because it provides an acute and developing cognitive capacity to differentiate. In this regard, architecture, driven by the creativity geometry affords, is a form of modeling with the types of construction Alexander finds distasteful, just a recent form of expression. Hence, I consider Alexander promotes an architecture that is iconic and indexically rich, but he dismisses the generative capacity of abstract articulation through convention, in other words, symbolic reasoning. But what is particularly convincing in Alexander's argument is the idea that a whole makes its parts rather than the idea that a whole consists of parts. To clarify the difference, he calls the parts made by a whole centers, as I've mentioned previously, and stresses there are some or many centers within a whole, and that they intensify each other, which transfers to the degree of life something has, such that something with few centers is less alive than something with many. Note that the boundary of a center is not something distinct. It refers to a source that is perceivable and affects. So at the root of Alexander's argument is the idea that order, which equates to good design or something that is beautiful, affects us. We feel it. So each step in the process of formation involves interpretation of what is presented, and the response is defined by properties by which to respond. And these are properties evident throughout nature. So Alexander identifies 15 fundamental properties which intensify each other. So if we adhere to these and apply them in a manner whereby we respond to what occurs in their application, as natural systems do, then good design will follow. The different principles transfer. For example, forming a boundary, which is what I'm trying to indicate here, forming a boundary infers positive space, defines contrast, suggests void and not separateness. So essentially, what Alexander presents is an unfolding process of design. He says a living process is any adaptive process which generates living structure, step by step, through structure-preserving transformations. This is not done by trial and error. Rather, the process has the feature that a coherent whole emerges step by step, preserving what was there before. Yet at each moment in the development from the additional lies dormant structure which has potential to prompt transformations that also have the ability to create something new. Hence, the process performs a seeming miracle that it respects what was there before, yet also manages to take the structure in a new direction towards something which was not there or evident before, which occurs not by arbitrary insertion of arbitrary new structure, but by pulling on latent aspects of the structure that are already present, yet not visible or manifest. I should have said that's a quote. That's the end of the quote. He's stressing that within an unfolding process, there is latent structure, like in the example of the dot I showed earlier, and that in this latent structure lies potential for novelty. Now, this differs from the general idea that for real change or for novelty to occur, something absolute or new needs to be added to the mix, so to say. Peter Cariani, in his paper Emergence and Creativity, points out for creative novelty to emerge, new primitives need to be introduced into the system by external proxies or processes. Effectively, a trigger needs to be introduced. Hence, one needs a means of adding said new primitive into the mix, whereas Alexander is stressing nothing should be added. Instead, features that lie dormant in the conformation should be acted upon. He states this is what natural systems do and what ought to be capitalized on and leveraged in design. So this process of unfolding form, I think, correlates to the Peircean sign model, whereby the categories account for the development of a new or more evolved sign. Peirce presents an iterative process but this is not necessarily recurrent. As a generative process, semiosis is continuous, but not continually growing. It's evolutionary. So instead of constant change, there are continuous cycles in which step changes can occur. So there are moments of transition between phases of stability whereby a habitual condition can topple into a different or new regime. So effectively, what Alexander is referring to and portraying in his methodology of unfolding form is morphogenesis, which he defines in terms of geometry, physics, and biology, arising through 15 principles applied sequentially through sensibilities, meaning the next step is informed by the impact the description has on the emerging form. So Alexander presents an unfolding process of differentiation whereby wholeness emerges because of features and qualities inherent in preceding form. This implies temporality and space as something dynamic. But Alexander doesn't talk about time. I mean, he's got 4 books to explain this. So you stack them up, it's like this. He doesn't talk about time. And he talks quite a lot about space. He claims a nuanced idea of space, but in the end, he defaults to the typical idea that space is the negative of form. There are two issues with his argument, as I see it, which stem from how he sees wholeness as defined by structure, which is geometrical. Both lie in how he presents geometry and space, both of which tied to the general idea that space is container-like, which being geometrical is defined by implicit rules or criteria. From a biological and generative design perspective, space is something other. Uxkall tells us this and goes to great lengths to describe space semiotically. That space is functional, a matter of Umwelten tied to the functional cycle, and so a product of perception and action. But he doesn't explicitly state what space is. He instead describes how it works according to an organism. Uxkall's analysis is founded in Kant, who considers geometry the basis of knowledge. Thus, when we were talking about geometry, we're also implicitly talking about space. The two are, in Kant's terms, isotropic. So geometry is a powerful method of analytical representation, a form of abstraction that has become ingrained in how we think. It obfuscates, it kind of mists how we think about the world. For example, nothing in nature draws a circle. We observe things like circles, which are conceptual tokens to explain something we think of as a circle. And this has come to define how we think spatially. Okay, that's the end of part one. Let's step back to the general idea that order concerns comparing features and attributes to form arrangements, the effect of which is that we categorize things relationally. This is done to understand the world, and through describing things we observe to know our place, essentially ironing out uncertainty to achieve coherence between self and other. And this brings me to René Thom and his semiophysics, which Thom explains is concerned in the first place with seeking out significant forms with the aim of building up a general theory of intelligibility. Now, I'm only going to touch on Thom. The aim is to draw a correlation with the idea of code duality. And I proceed with caution because I admit my reading of Thom is basic, so my conclusions are open and serve as markers for further investigation. Unless you say it's rubbish. Okay, so for Thom, the morphologies of the human sphere are linked to morphologies found in animals and the nature surrounding animals. The visual, acoustic, olfactory, and tactile media of communication have their basis in the corporeality and vital functions of living beings. For Thom, the spatial and temporal aspects of phenomena are primary. So he starts from a geometric point of view, formulating features topologically to demarcate hierarchies, grouping elements according to association, building a picture of wholes as compositions of parts and parts of parts. Fundamental for Thom is the distinction between forms that have salience or pregnancy, which circumscribe to forces at work in the creation of which circumscribe to forces at work in the creation and stable use of semiotic patterns. Forms of salience and pregnance are discontinuities, which is a matter central to the idea of code duality. Salience relates to the sense organs, sight, hearing, smell, so forth, and the affordances in this surrounding world. So a salient form stands out. It's something identified from other. Pregnancy considers the biological and mental functions of action and communication linked to perceiving salient features and perceptually controlled action. So a form with pregnance is ipso facto salient, but it carries significance, and the recognition gives rise or is coupled with an effect prompting physical change or behaviors. So Thom presents a process of meaning building between forms of discontinuity, stating, quote, "The primary experience in any receiving phenomena is discontinuity, but discontinuity presupposes continuity. As our first experience of the continuous of the continuous is that of consciousness, i.e. that of time, the most original auditive discontinuity will be, for example, the eruption of a sound in the midst of silence. End the first part of this quote. Now, I would consider this eruption of sound in the silence, which Thom correlates to continuity, being time, as a cleavage. And in this separation, at least for me, we move from time to an understanding of what is space. But this, the way I'm reading this, doesn't seem to correlate with how Thom goes on to explain it. That is, start the quote again, if we move from time to space, then a salient form can be said to be any visually presented perceived object clearly distinct from and contrasting with its background, the substrate space in which the form dwells. Generally, a salient form that is seen will have an interior in the field of vision and will present a boundary, its apparent outline. For me, the first part of this quote has all the richness I need in it for me to make sense of what I'm trying to portray. But he goes on, I just think he complicates things. He defaults back to this kind of view that I struggle with what Alexander's saying. For me, the richness in what Thom is presenting in the first part, i.e. the cleavage, is lost. How forms of discontinuity propagate and generate meaning, which he states is according to two modes, propagation by contiguity and propagation by similarity. So Thom probably does mean this, and maybe it's a misreading from my side, but effectively for Thom, the beauty in this is the simplicity that time is continuity, and space is a discontinuity, which for me, this feeds into what Uxkall presents. It correlates with Bateson and Peirce in understanding of signs as growing and the idea of difference is a difference. And importantly, it feeds into what Lee Smolin, a contemporary physicist, says that time is fundamental and space is emergent. So the discontinuity might be the tinkle of a bell, the example that Thom gives, perceives an autonomous form and a stimulus that excites some effect in the percipient, or as Bateson says, a difference that makes a difference, which provokes and through differentiation, resulting through capitalizing on latent form, incites change and generates more developed form. Now, I know living systems are coupled to the external world, so I'm not trying to promote a machine-like model. My point is the interplay between ensuing form and description. The novelty, we might say, occurs through responding to latent features which involve some form of recognition, or we might say interpretation. And this leads me to Hoffmeyer and Emmek's idea of code duality. But I'd first like to point out that I think this idea of latent structure that Alexander points to and which provokes shifts in confirmation is akin to what Don Favreau calls a relevant next, whereby living or abductive systems capitalize on what we might call perceptible qualities, i.e. they capitalize on this latency. But lurking in the background also, so to speak, are a priori qualities, such as the musical scale and the color spectrum, which Uxkall refers to as natural laws, which coupled with a percipient's constitution or body plan, enable the subject to build their world. So I'll bring this to a close with Hoffmeyer and Emmek's code duality, describing the emergence of form and evolving semiotic dynamic arising through the interplay between two codes, one analog, one digital, which are equally necessary forms of referential activity. The digital being syntactical, involving symbolic forms and correlates to memory and transference. The analog involving iconic and indexical is active and dynamic and semantically rich or pregnant with meaning. Like Thom's form of salience and pregnance, digital and analog codes are forms of discontinuity. Hoffmeyer emphasizes how a description transcribed into form is transformed through material action and folding relations specified in the description, and how this generates process of formation leads to differentiation, which is variety of order. Alexander presents a compelling definition of order through which form arises as a product of feedback and adaptation, whereby latent features can trigger new forms. But he extends this to emphasize what he thinks is beautiful, and in so doing dismisses the symbolic nature of our species. So I counter Alexander and suggest that beauty meets an inherent need for meaningful information, understanding information as discontinuities, which provokes space, a cleavage in its simplest form in the continuity, which we can understand as having salience or pregnance and involving digital and analog interplay. So to conclude, order is about ironing out uncertainty to achieve coherence between self and other. It's a process of becoming, involving distinguishing between discontinuities, which can have salient form, being prominent, or a form with a pregnance having physiological effect on the percipient. This is effected through semiotic interplay between forms that are iconic, andexical, symbolical, and transferred to being digital or analog in their formation, transcribed in time or unfolding with regards to their significance at a given time in a certain place. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Could you maybe just stop sharing at the top?
Yeah.
And we have time for questions. Online. Okay, Carl.
Thank you, Tim. It was really, for me, like all encompassing. I don't know the Alexander story and so on, but so you were talking about the space as exploiting the non-Euclidean geometries, while the time as just Euclidean, according to the René Thom you refer to, or
Well, yes and no. I mean, in terms of, so you're referring to that slide and at the bottom underneath fundamental, emergent, there's a priori, a posterior, then there's Euclidean and non-Euclidean.
So my point was that if you will design some space, to live, for example, and make some, let's say, parts of this, let's say flat or something, more appealing than the other, so that we'll spend more time at some places, so that will deform the time scale. And, like that via space, maybe you can deform the time. I mean the time in the Aeschylean, I mean the biological time and space. And the architecture may serve as a kind of this spatial temporal machine, like a machine, I mean, like a temporal machine. So what do you think about this?
I have absolutely no idea.
So sorry.
That's okay.
No, so I was like to provide you something like to comment on how architecture can change our spatial temporal reality, that we are perceiving, despite the fact that it's a geometrical and objectively describable and so on.
My point isn't about the architecture. My point is about order, and that, Alexander's another architect, right? And he's trying to explain how we formulate order or our place in the world. And the built environment is the fundamental expression of that. We spend most of our time in and around the built environment. And consequently, the way we do that has become in the last 100 years very abstract. So he dismisses that. He dislikes it massively. So he looks at nature, and he looks at nature, and he's identified, I think, a very impressive aspects of natural forms where they capitalize on latent structure, and consequently he translates that to architecture. I'm just trying to suggest that is what architecture should do, but at the same time the abstraction that has become part of how we work is fundamental to the way we think. We require abstraction. The discontinuity is an abstraction itself. It's what Bateson talks about, the slap. So I think for me, and that also at the same time boils down to how I understand space, or how I'm coming to, I've in the latest iteration come to see it.
Thanks.